February draped the city in a melancholy grey, where snowflakes danced hesitantly, unwilling to settle on the cobbled streets. Emily Carter sat at her desk, the dim glow of her office lamp barely illuminating the mountain of files before her. Her heart ached faintly with the weight of another Valentine's Day spent alone. A silent melody of solitude that had become all too familiar. Her thoughts wandered as she reached for her coffee mug, only to freeze mid-motion. There, amid the scattered documents, lay an envelope. Its surface was smooth, almost glowing faintly against the mundane clutter of her workspace. It bore no stamp, no address, no indication of its origin, only her name, written in an elegant hand that seemed to breathe on the page. Emily hesitated. The air around her grew heavier, as though the room held its breath. She tore the envelope open, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, a single card bore the words, "You are invited to an unforgettable Valentine's retreat. Departure, February 12th, 7 p.m. Trust the path." No signature, no further details. Her mind raced. A prank? A mistake? Yet something about the card whispered a deeper truth, one she couldn't yet grasp. The words "trust the path" lingered in her thoughts like an ancient riddle. Against her better judgment, curiosity began to eclipse doubt. Perhaps, she reasoned, a change of scenery would be a welcome escape from her predictable life. 3 days later, Emily found herself standing on the platform of a nearly deserted train station. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of impending snow. A sleek, old-fashioned train stood waiting, its polished silver exterior reflecting the dim glow of lanterns. The sight struck her as oddly surreal, as though she'd stepped into another era. As she boarded, the conductor, an elderly man with eyes that seemed too young for his weathered face, tipped his hat. "Miss Carter," he greeted, his voice smooth, yet tinged with an unplaceable sadness. Emily blinked. "You know my name?" The conductor offered no answer, only gesturing toward her seat. Her unease deepened as she settled into the plush leather chair. The cabin was empty save for her, its window shrouded by an unnatural fog. The train lurched forward, and the cityscape outside blurred into obscurity. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks was hypnotic. Yet Emily couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone. A soft whisper grazed her ear, indistinct but intimate, like a forgotten melody. She spun around, her pulse quickening, but the cabin was silent. Only her reflection stared back, its expression almost questioning. Hours passed, though Emily couldn't tell how many. Time felt elastic, stretching and contracting in unnatural ways. The fog outside grew denser, swallowing any trace of the world she'd left behind. She began to feel as though the train wasn't merely transporting her to a destination, but carrying her into another realm entirely. When the train finally screeched to a halt, Emily stepped out onto a platform bathed in moonlight. Before her stood a grand oceanfront mansion, its towering spires clawing at the starless sky. The sound of waves crashing against unseen cliffs filled the air, mingling with the distant cry of a lone seabird. The mansion's windows flickered with warm light, yet the structure seemed to pulse with an energy that unsettled her. The other passengers, strangers clad in evening attire, moved toward the mansion as if in a trance, their faces oddly expressionless. Emily hesitated, a chill crawling down her spine. "Trust the path," the words on the card echoed in her mind. Steeling herself, she took a deep breath and followed the crowd, the heels of her boots clicking against the cobblestones. As she stepped through the ornate double doors, the air inside shifted, heavy, with the scent of sea salt and roses. A sense of déjà vu washed over her, stronger than ever before. She couldn't explain it, but something about this place felt achingly familiar, as though she'd been here in another life. And in the shadowed corners of the grand hall, unseen eyes seemed to watch her every move. The grand hall of the mansion seemed alive, as though it breathed with an unseen rhythm. Emily's steps slowed, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns carved into the vaulted ceilings. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen galaxies, their light refracting into 1,000 fleeting rainbows. Guests milled about, their laughter and conversation a soft hum that felt strangely detached, like echoes of a party held long ago. Her gaze fell upon the sea-facing windows. Beyond them, moonlight caressed the restless waves, each crest shimmering with silver. Emily felt a pull toward the ocean, its rhythmic crashing calling to her like a siren song. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice startled her. Deep, smooth, and tinged with an inexplicable familiarity, it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to find a man standing at her side. His dark hair framed a face that seemed sculpted from shadows and light. His eyes, strikingly clear and piercing, bore into hers with an intensity that made her heart falter. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's haunting." The man smiled, though it wasn't one of amusement. "Haunting. That's a fitting word for this place." She studied him, an unspoken question forming on her lips. There was something about him, an air of knowing, as though he understood her better than she understood herself. "Have we met before?" she asked, unable to suppress the thought. His smile deepened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he extended a hand. "I'm Lucas." "Emily," she replied, hesitating before taking his hand. The moment their palms touched, a jolt shot through her, not of pain but of recognition. Images flickered in her mind, a stormy sea, a pair of hands reaching out, and a name she couldn't quite catch whispered on the wind. She blinked, and the visions were gone. "Are you all right?" Lucas's voice was gentle, yet there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Concern, perhaps, or guilt. Yes, I'm fine. She withdrew her hand, the sensation lingering like the echo of a distant bell. Do you live here? Lucas's gaze drifted toward the windows, his expression unreadable. In a way, he said, the cryptic answer raising more questions than it resolved. Come with me. There's something you should see. Despite herself, Emily followed him as he led her out through a side door and onto the cliffs that bordered the estate. The wind was fierce, tugging at her hair and filling her lungs with the sharp tang of salt. Below, the sea roared, its waves crashing against jagged rocks with an almost mournful rhythm. Lucas stopped at the edge, his silhouette framed by the vast expanse of the night sky. He turned to face her, his expression now shadowed with an emotion she couldn't place. This place is more than it seems, he said, his voice low. The mansion, the sea, even the people inside. It's all part of a story that's been repeating for centuries. Emily frowned, her unease growing. What are you talking about? You don't remember yet, Lucas murmured, more to himself than to her. But you will. Remember what? She pressed, her frustration breaking through the haze of mystery. Lucas, if you know something, just tell me. His eyes softened, though the intensity in them didn't waver. Do you believe in fate, Emily? The question caught her off guard. I'm not sure, she admitted. I've always thought we make our own choices. And what if some choices are written long before we're born? Lucas stepped closer, his presence both comforting and unnerving. What if the paths we walk are part of a story we've forgotten? A story waiting for its ending? Emily's pulse quickened. The way he spoke felt personal, as though he wasn't talking about fate in general, but something specific to them. You're not making any sense, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Lucas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object. He held it out to her, a locket, tarnished with age but unmistakably beautiful. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. As she opened it, a faint melody played, soft and sorrowful. Inside was a miniature painting of two figures standing by the sea. One of them was unmistakably her. Emily's breath caught. How? You're starting to remember, Lucas said, his voice barely audible over the wind. This isn't the first time we've stood here, Emily, and it won't be the last. Emily clutched the locket, her fingers trembling, as if the small object contained the weight of 1,000 secrets. The melody faded into the night, leaving only the relentless crash of the waves below. She couldn't look away from the miniature painting. The likeness of her face was too precise, too familiar to dismiss as coincidence. How did you get this? Her voice quivered, balancing on the edge of disbelief and fear. Lucas took a measured step closer, his expression cloaked in shadow and sorrow. It was yours, he said softly. A long time ago. That's impossible, Emily whispered. though the conviction in her words wavered. Something inside her, something buried deep, stirred at his words. Flashes of fragmented memories, storm-tossed waters, a desperate embrace. The sound of a name carried on the wind danced on the edges of her consciousness, just out of reach. "You don't believe me?" Lucas said, his tone more resigned than accusatory. He turned his gaze toward the sea, where the waves churned with an unnatural energy, as if mirroring the turmoil within her. "But you felt it, haven't you? That pull, the sense that you've been here before." Emily wanted to deny it, to brush off his cryptic words as fantasy. But how could she explain the haunting familiarity of this place? The way her heart ached, as if mourning something lost, something she couldn't even name. What happened to us? The question escaped her lips before she realized she'd spoken it. Lucas's shoulders tensed, and for a moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with pain. "We were in love. Once. But our story was cut short. By jealousy, by betrayal, by forces neither of us could control. And since then..." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Since then, we've been trapped in a cycle. Meeting, forgetting, losing each other again. Over and over." Emily shook her head, a cold laugh escaping her. "You're saying we're... what? Reincarnated lovers? Destined to keep finding each other?" "It's more than that," Lucas said, his voice growing firmer. "There's a curse, a punishment for something we didn't do. And until it's broken, we'll keep reliving this endless loop of loss." The air seemed to thicken around them, charged with an unspoken tension. Emily wanted to protest, to demand proof, but the words caught in her throat. The locket in her hand felt impossibly heavy now, its presence a silent affirmation of Lucas's impossible tale. As if sensing her inner conflict, Lucas stepped closer. His hand brushed hers, and the contact sent a jolt through her. Suddenly, the fragmented images in her mind coalesced into something more vivid, more tangible. She saw herself standing on a windswept beach, her dress soaked through with rain. Lucas was there, his arms wrapped around her as the storm raged. She heard his voice, urgent and filled with desperation. "Promise me," he was saying. "Promise me you'll remember, no matter what happens." "I promise," her past self whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Then came the sound of thunder, a blinding flash of light, and a scream, her scream, before the vision dissolved into darkness. Emily staggered back, the locket slipping from her hand and landing softly in the grass. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. What was that?" "Your memories," Lucas said gently. "Or the beginnings of them. The curse has kept them buried, but they're still there, waiting to resurface." Emily pressed a hand to her forehead, her thoughts spinning in chaotic loops. She wanted to dismiss it all as madness, but the vision had felt so real, so visceral, and the emotions it stirred, grief, longing, love, were too powerful to ignore. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why now?" Lucas bent down to retrieve the locket, his movements slow and deliberate. "Because this time is different," he said, holding the locket out to her. "This time, we have a chance to break the cycle, but only if you're willing to face the truth." Emily stared at him, the weight of his words sinking into her. She didn't know what terrified her more, the possibility that he was lying, or the possibility that he wasn't. Behind them, the mansion's windows flickered, the lights within shifting and dimming as though responding to an unseen force. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, ghostly melody that made Emily's skin prickle. "Come with me," Lucas said, his voice steady but urgent. "There's more you need to see." Despite the fear twisting in her gut, Emily nodded. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her knew she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when the echoes of a forgotten life were beginning to call her name. The cliffside path wound downward, carved into jagged stone that seemed ancient and unyielding, yet eerily familiar. Emily followed Lucas, her steps careful, though her thoughts were anything but steady. The moon hung low, casting a silver glow on the tumultuous sea below, its waves shimmering as if secrets stirred within their depths. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely carrying over the gusting wind. "You'll see," Lucas replied without turning. His tone was calm, but laced with an urgency that set her heart racing. They reached a narrow plateau overlooking the sea, where the ruins of an old chapel stood shrouded in shadow. Ivy crawled over the crumbling stone walls, and the arched windows gaped like empty eyes, gazing into the void of the night. Despite its decay, the place thrummed with an energy that made the hair on Emily's arms rise. Lucas stopped at the entrance, his silhouette framed by the remnants of the once grand doorway. "This is where it began," he said, "and where it must end." Emily hesitated, her pulse quickening. The chapel loomed before her, silent and watchful, as though it had been waiting for her all this time. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, the air shifting around her like a sigh. The interior was hollow and dark, lit only by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the broken windows. At the center of the chapel stood a stone altar, weathered by time but still imposing. On its surface lay an open book, its pages illuminated by an otherworldly light. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas approached the altar, his gaze fixed on the book. "This is where the curse was cast," he said. "And this," he gestured to the glowing tome, "is the record of our story. Every life we've lived, every time we've been torn apart." Emily moved closer, her eyes drawn to the book's pages. As she peered down, words began to form, written in a script that seemed to shimmer and shift, evading comprehension. But as she stared, the letters solidified, and scenes began to unfold in her mind. She saw herself and Lucas in another time, another world. They were standing on this very cliff, their hands entwined as the storm clouds gathered. There was love in their eyes, but also fear. Fear of what was to come. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its presence cold and menacing. Words were spoken, sharp and cutting, but Emily couldn't make them out. The figure raised its hands, and a surge of energy erupted, sending Emily and Lucas tumbling into the sea below. The vision shifted, showing countless lifetimes, different eras, different faces, but always the same ending: separation, pain, and loss. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Emily gasping. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the altar for support. Why? Why would someone do this to us? Lucas's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with anger and sorrow. Jealousy, he said. The curse was cast by someone who couldn't bear to see us together. They thought that if they couldn't have you, no one could. Emily's chest tightened, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. So we've been reliving this nightmare over and over. Lucas nodded. But this time is different. The curse was meant to ensure we'd never remember, never find a way to break free. But something's changed. You're remembering, Emily, and that means there's hope. She stared at him, her mind racing. How do we end it? Lucas hesitated, his gaze flickering to the book. We have to confront the curse directly. The one who cast it left a piece of their essence here, binding the spell to this place. If we destroy it, we can break the cycle. But... He trailed off, his expression pained. But what? Emily pressed. There's a risk, Lucas admitted. If we fail, the curse could trap us forever. No more cycles. No more chances. The enormity of his words settled over her like a storm cloud. The idea of eternity bound in darkness was terrifying. But the thought of continuing the endless cycle of pain and loss was equally unbearable. Emily clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. I'm tired of running, Lucas. Tired of losing you. If there's even a chance we can end this, I'll take it. Lucas's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. You've always been braver than me, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Come on. The essence is here, somewhere beneath the altar. We'll face it together. Together, they began to lift the heavy stone slab, the weight almost unbearable. Beneath it, a faint glow pulsed, revealing a crystal shard that radiated a dark, malevolent energy. As Emily reached for it, the air around them grew colder, and the shadows in the chapel began to move. The curse, it seemed, was not going to let them go without a fight. The crystal shard pulsed with an ominous light, its glow casting jagged shadows across the chapel walls. The air thickened, carrying with it a suffocating chill. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the shard, her hand hovering over its surface. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, but the weight of countless lifetimes bore down on her shoulders. She could not falter now. Lucas knelt beside her, his hand steadying hers. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "We do this together." Emily nodded, her resolve firming. Together they reached for the shard. The moment their fingers brushed its surface, the world around them erupted. The ground shook violently and a deafening roar filled the air, as though the very fabric of the chapel protested their defiance. Shadows spilled from the shard like living ink, coalescing into a figure that towered over them. Its form was formless yet menacing, its eyes twin voids that bore into Emily's soul. The figure's voice was a cacophony, echoing with malice and pain. "You dare defy me?" it hissed, its words laced with ancient fury. "Your love is a weakness, a folly. It will always end in despair." Emily felt Lucas's grip tighten on her hand, grounding her against the entity's overwhelming presence. "Our love is not a weakness," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "It's what keeps us fighting. It's what brought us here." The figure laughed, a sound that rattled the very stones of the chapel. "You think your love can break what has been forged in hatred? You are fools, bound to repeat your suffering for eternity." Lucas stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Not this time. This time, we end it." The figure lunged, its shadowy tendrils striking out with a ferocity that made Emily's heart seize. Instinctively, she raised the shard, its light flaring in response. The shadows recoiled, writhing as the crystal's glow grew brighter. "You hold the key," the figure snarled, its voice trembling with something Emily couldn't quite place. Fear. "But you will not survive what comes next." As the entity surged forward again, Emily and Lucas locked eyes. Time seemed to slow, and in that moment she saw everything. Every lifetime, every heartbreak, every promise whispered beneath the stars. Despite the pain, there was a thread of unyielding love that had carried them through. It was their strength, their anchor. "Together," Emily said, her voice steady. Lucas nodded. "Together." With a united cry, they thrust the shard into the heart of the shadowy figure. A blinding light erupted, consuming everything in its path. Emily felt an intense heat, followed by a bone-deep cold, as though the universe itself was being torn apart. For a moment, she thought she might dissolve into the light, her very essence unraveling. But then, the pressure lifted. The roar faded, replaced by an almost deafening silence. Emily opened her eyes to find herself standing in the chapel, the air still and calm. The shard lay in fragments at her feet, its dark energy dissipated. The shadowy figure was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its malevolence. Lucas was beside her, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The curse is broken." Emily felt a weight lift from her chest, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. The chapel, once cold and decayed, seemed to glow with a newfound light. The walls were no longer crumbling, the air no longer oppressive. It was as though the place itself had been freed. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sea with hues of gold and pink. Emily and Lucas stepped out onto the cliffs, the wind carrying the scent of salt and renewal. For the first time, Emily felt truly free. She turned to Lucas, her heart swelling with a love that transcended words. "No more cycles," she said. "No more losing each other." Lucas cupped her face in his hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "No more," he agreed. As the sun rose higher, its light washing over them, Emily felt the bond between them solidify, an eternal thread no longer bound by curses or fate. They had defied the darkness, reclaimed their love, and rewritten their story. The waves below whispered their blessing, carrying the echoes of their triumph to the farthest reaches of the sea. And as Emily and Lucas stood together, hand in hand, they knew they were no longer prisoners of their past, but architects of their future, forever bound not by fate, but by the strength of their love.